Michael Harrow was the kind of man no one in Brooksville ever noticed quiet, reliable, the kind of neighbor who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and waved politely at passing cars. That was before his name became forever linked to the most bizarre emergency case in the town's history, 372 calls to 911 in a single day. What began as a trickle of silent calls would soon spiral into a storm that crippled the very system designed to save lives, pulling police, dispatchers, and the entire community into a mystery that still defies explanation. On the morning of October 14th, the dispatch center in Brooksville opened its doors like any other day. The small town rarely saw serious emergencies, and most calls were for minor accidents or routine concerns. The operators settled into their chairs, sipping coffee and watching the clock tick by. Then, at 8:02 a.m., the first call came in. The line opened with a faint crackle, but no voice followed. The operator waited, repeating the standard greeting, but the silence stretched out until the call ended. They logged it as a dropped connection and moved on. 2 minutes later, the same number appeared again. This time, the sound of breathing could be heard for a split second before the caller hung up. Odd, but still nothing unusual in the world of emergency dispatch. Pocket dials, confused callers, and technical glitches were common enough. By 8:15 a.m., the number had appeared on the screen 6 more times. Each call ended the same way, either silence, static, or a faint click before the line went dead. The operators began exchanging glances. One joked under their breath about a prankster with too much free time, but the laughter quickly faded as the calls continued to stack up. By 9 a.m., there were more than 30. The call center wasn't overwhelmed yet, but the irritation was clear. Each false alarm forced someone to pick up, someone to respond, someone to log the details. The rhythm of the day had been broken, and tension was building. The pattern grew stranger as the morning wore on. The calls weren't evenly spaced. They came in waves, rapid bursts of 5 or 6 in under a minute, followed by stretches of silence. During those bursts, it was impossible to keep up. One operator would answer, only for another phone to ring instantly, and then another. To make matters worse, each call seemed deliberately brief, cut off at just the right moment before a trace could be completed. The system wasn't designed to handle harassment at this scale. It was designed to save lives. At 10 a.m., the count reached 90. Dispatchers were juggling real emergencies: an elderly woman with chest pain, a traffic accident on the highway, while being bombarded by the same repeating number. Frustration gave way to unease. No prankster in Brooksville had ever gone this far. Someone was tying up the most critical line in the town, and if another serious emergency happened, help might not arrive in time. The stakes were no longer just about annoyance. Lives were on the line. One operator noticed something that chilled the room further. Every time a real emergency call was connected, the harassing number would appear within seconds, almost as if whoever was calling knew when the system was busy. It was too precise to be random, too deliberate to be ignored. The idea of a simple prank no longer fit. By noon, the number of calls had reached more than 100 and rising, and the question hanging in the air grew darker with each passing hour. Who was on the other end of the line, and what did they want? By the time the clock struck noon, the Brooksville Dispatch Center was in chaos. The lines blinked endlessly, flashing red and ringing with a shrill persistence that echoed through the cramped room. Every seat was filled, every operator glued to their headset, scrambling to separate genuine cries for help from the onslaught of meaningless interruptions. The town had never faced a crisis like this before, not on the streets, but inside the very system meant to protect it. For the first time, operators feared that someone calling with a real emergency might not get through in time. The official tally crossed 100 calls before lunch, and each new ring from the same number piled pressure onto the room. The usual steady hum of conversation was replaced with an edge of panic. Reports began trickling in from across town. A man collapsed in a grocery store aisle. A car swerved off the road into a ditch. A child was found missing from a playground. Each situation demanded swift coordination, but every time dispatchers tried to handle them, the flood of false calls interrupted. It felt like an invisible hand was gripping the throat of the town, squeezing tighter with each minute. Police officers were called off routine patrols to investigate the source. They traced the number to a registered cell phone, but that only deepened the mystery. The account belonged to a local man with no criminal record, no history of pranks, and no reason to sabotage his own community. Attempts to contact him failed. Every time investigators tried to call back, the line rang once and cut off, as though the phone was being used by someone who refused to answer. The possibility of a stolen device was raised. Yet there was no evidence to support it. The strange precision of the harassment seemed calculated, almost strategic, as though someone was studying how quickly the system could collapse. By mid-afternoon, the situation had become a full-scale emergency in its own right. Supervisors ordered extra staff into the dispatch center, but even with more hands on deck, the waves of calls drowned their efforts. Some operators had to hang up on the harassing number mid-ring just to keep the lines open. Others tried leaving one line constantly connected to the mysterious caller, but it ended in silence every time. It wasn't just an attack on their patience, it was crippling the town's ability to function. The mayor and police chief held a private meeting behind closed doors, debating whether to alert the public. Fear of panic weighed heavily against the need for transparency. If residents knew that the 911 system was under siege, some might hesitate to call in an actual emergency, assuming they would never get through. But keeping it secret carried its own risks. If someone died because their call was lost in the flood, the responsibility would fall on everyone who failed to act sooner. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the call count climbed toward 200 with no sign of slowing. Each unanswered question hung like a storm cloud over Brooksville. Was it the act of a bored troublemaker, a disturbed mind unraveling, or something far more calculated? The town's lifeline was unraveling in real time, and no one knew how long they could hold out before something irreversible happened. Investigators decided to move beyond the dispatch center and into the field. They worked with a phone company, requesting an urgent trace on the mysterious number. The process was slower than anyone wanted, and every passing hour meant dozens of new calls flooding the system. The first results came back in the late afternoon. The calls were bouncing across multiple towers, making it look as though the phone was constantly on the move. That discovery unsettled the officers. Brooksville was small, and the idea of a device circling town while tormenting its only emergency system seemed almost taunting. When the data was filtered further, the reality became even stranger. The phone wasn't moving at all. Despite appearing to hop between towers, the signal originated from a fixed point, a location that placed it squarely inside a quiet residential street on the north side of town. The address tied directly back to the missing man whose name appeared on the account. His name was Michael Harrow, a 42-year-old who worked as a mechanic. He had no enemies, no history of mental illness, and no reason anyone could imagine for bringing an entire community to its knees with a series of silent calls. What unsettled the officers more was the fact that Michael had been reported missing just 3 days earlier by his sister. She had last seen him outside his garage, promising to meet her for dinner, but he never showed up. Officers were dispatched to his home. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. His car sat in the driveway. His mailbox overflowed with untouched letters. The house was locked tight with no signs of forced entry. When they finally gained access, the scene inside was eerily ordinary. The living room was tidy, the kitchen held a sink of unwashed dishes, and his wallet, car keys, and jacket were still on the counter as if he had planned to return within minutes. There was no evidence of a struggle, no blood, and no sign that anyone else had been inside. The only thing missing was Michael himself. The search of the home turned up one key clue. His cell phone, the very device flooding 911, was nowhere to be found. Officers swept the property with signal-detecting equipment, but the trace placed the phone inside the residence. They checked every drawer, every shelf, even the attic, but it refused to appear. It was as though the phone was inside the house and invisible at the same time. The strangest detail was the call pattern itself. Every burst of calls matched times when officers were active at the scene. It was as if the device knew they were there and was responding to their presence. The discovery unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. How could a man vanish without a trace while his phone continued to operate as though on autopilot? The question deepened when they learned the calls weren't random. They were occurring in sequences: 3, then 7, then 3 again. To most, it looked like chaos. To some, it began to resemble a code. And as the sun set on the second day of harassment, Brooksville realized that the disappearance of Michael Harrow might be more than just a missing persons case. It was becoming the heart of a mystery that pulled the entire town into its grip. Night settled heavily over Brooksville as investigators decided to comb through Michael Harrow's property once again. They were convinced the phone had to be inside. The constant ringing at the dispatch center continued like a metronome of unease, each new call hammering the urgency of the search. Officers fanned out through the house, moving with slow precision, tapping on walls, testing floorboards, and pulling furniture away from corners that hadn't been touched in years. The first 2 sweeps yielded nothing. Then, near the back of the basement, one officer paused. Behind a row of rusted shelving stacked with old paint cans was a faint vibration, a mechanical hum that seemed too steady to be coincidence. The shelves were dragged aside, and what looked like a solid wall revealed something unusual. A wooden panel sat flush against the concrete, dust clinging to its edges. When pried loose, it exposed a narrow crawl space, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. At the end was a trapdoor, its hinges stiff with age. The officers exchanged wary looks before forcing it open. Inside lay a hidden room, small and suffocating, with a low ceiling and air that smelled of stale dust and old paper. The missing cell phone rested on a crude wooden table, upright on a metal stand. Its screen glowed faintly, redialing 911 again and again in rapid sequence, almost as if locked in an endless loop. Next to it sat a tangle of wires, an old laptop, and several battered notebooks. The phone wasn't broken, hacked, or altered. It was dialing on its own. Even when investigators powered it off, it came alive moments later, the screen flashing and the calls resuming without any input. The notebooks scattered across the walls of the room revealed another layer of strangeness. Michael had filled them with frantic handwriting, pages crowded with numbers, symbols, and maps of cell towers stretching far beyond Brooksville. Phrases repeated over and over, scribbled in dark ink. They are watching. The lines are not safe. Emergency is the only way through. The words hinted at a paranoid obsession, though whether it was born from delusion or genuine fear was unclear. There was no bed, no food, no signs that anyone had lived in the hidden chamber for long. It felt more like a bunker built for short bursts of use rather than shelter. But one chilling detail made the officers pause. On one wall, pinned beneath tape, were printouts of call logs, hundreds of 911 entries carefully circled and annotated, including times and dates that predated the current incident. Michael had been testing the system for weeks, maybe even months, building toward this massive burst of activity. The discovery was a breakthrough, but it brought no relief. Michael himself was nowhere in the house. Neighbors hadn't seen him since the night he vanished. His car remained untouched, his wallet still in place, and yet his presence lingered in the hidden room like a shadow. The phone continued its relentless assault on emergency lines, and investigators were left staring at a room that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a warning left behind by a man who seemed to know he was running out of time. Despite the discovery of the hidden room, the investigation hit a wall. The phone had been seized, the power stripped from it, yet the calls somehow continued. Each time officers thought they had silenced it, Dispatchers reported new bursts of activity from the same number, flooding the emergency lines with the same cold silence. The device itself was locked away in an evidence locker under heavy watch, but that did nothing to slow the assault. It was as though the phone had become untethered from its physical shell, dialing from nowhere and everywhere at once. For investigators, this shifted the case from a missing person into something far more unnerving. Search teams expanded their radius, combing through nearby woods, drainage tunnels, and abandoned buildings. Helicopters scanned open fields with thermal cameras. Divers searched a quarry on the edge of town. Not a trace of Michael was found. His bank accounts remained untouched, no credit card activity appeared, and no sightings were reported in neighboring towns. It was as though he had been swallowed whole by the earth. The only lingering sign of his existence was the endless ringing that strangled Brooksville's 911 system. Specialists from outside agencies were brought in to study the hidden room. They analyzed the notes, the maps, and the strange call logs. The writings revealed a clear pattern. Michael had believed someone was tracking him through communication networks. The calls, he wrote, were his only way to stay visible, his only way to prevent himself from being erased. The investigators debated whether this was a sign of paranoia or the fragmented reasoning of someone who had uncovered something real and dangerous. No conclusion satisfied them. Every answer led to darker questions. In the weeks that followed, the impact on Brooksville grew severe. A fire broke out in a trailer park, and responders were delayed because of clogged lines. A diabetic man slipped into crisis, and his daughter's desperate call struggled to cut through the flood. These tragedies hardened public anger, turning Michael into a phantom villain in the eyes of many, a man who had endangered lives for reasons no one could understand. But others whispered that perhaps he had stumbled onto something greater than himself, something that had consumed him before anyone could intervene. Then, abruptly, the calls stopped one morning without warning. Dispatchers reported silence. The line that had rung 372 times in a single day was dead. No explanation followed. The phone in evidence remained dark, and no new traces were detected. For a brief moment, relief washed through the town, though it was laced with unease. The end was too clean, too sudden, like a door slamming shut before anyone could glimpse what lay on the other side. Michael Harrow was never found. His disappearance became another unsolved entry in the county archives. His house eventually sold to a new family who never knew about the trapdoor beneath the basement. But among those who worked the dispatch lines that day, the memory refused to fade. They spoke of the ceaseless ringing, the patterns in the silence, the way the calls seemed to watch and respond. To them, the mystery of Brooksville was not closed. It was waiting, buried in static, ready to return when someone least expected it.